In the spring of 2009, a land use coordinator named Dale Crum drove his consortium's white pickup up the long gravel lane to Nora Holt's farm in Addison County, Vermont, stepped out with a clipboard and a rolled survey map, and told her that the old sugar maple grove on the North Ridge was standing in the way of progress. He had a degree from the University of Vermont, a confident projection of easement values, and a check for $22,000. He called the grove a sentimental hobby operation. He said it with a mild smile and a patient voice, the way a person speaks when they have already settled the question in their own mind. Nora Holt listened to the whole offer. Then she told him no. 9 years later, in November of 2018, Nora's granddaughter Meg set a printed contract summary on the sugar house shelf beside Ruth Holt's green field notebook and read the gross revenue figure aloud. It was $187,400. That was for a single season's production, plus the first 2 payments under a standing co-op contract. It was more money than the entire farm had cleared in the previous 4 years combined. Nora picked the paper up once, set it back down, and walked outside. The maples were bare by then, November, and you could see the whole grove from the sugar house door, 91 taps across 63 trees, the oldest of them pushing 140 years in the ground. This is the story of those trees and what Nora Holt knew about them that Dale Crum did not. She was 63 years old in 2009, and she had farmed those 312 acres for 11 years by then, since her mother Ruth died in 1998 and left her the place. She was known for 2 things in Addison County: her patience, which bordered on the kind of stillness that made extension agents uncomfortable, and her sugar maples, which she tended the way a person tends something that cannot be replaced. The farm ran beef cattle on the lower fields, had a kitchen garden and a hay operation, but the grove on the North Ridge was the thing. It had been there before the Holt family owned the land. Ruth had found it that way when she married into the property in the late 1950s. 60-some trees spaced wide and loose across the hillside, the way old-growth timber spaces itself, each tree grown into its own light, canopy rarely touching. Ruth had not left it alone. Let me tell you what Ruth Holt did with that grove, because it is the foundation of everything that came later. In the early 1960s, Ruth identified 14 gaps in the stand where old trees had fallen or died, and she filled them with seedlings she had grown herself from seed collected on the property. Sugar maple to sugar maple. No nursery stock. She kept a spiral-bound green field notebook, and she recorded in it, year by year, the rotation of her tap locations on each tree, which face of the trunk she had tapped, what the sap sugar content had measured on a refractometer each morning of the run, what the weather had done overnight, what the boiling ratio had been. She kept this from 1961 until she was too sick to walk the grove in 1997. 36 years of daily observations across what became, by the time she finished, 91 tap points on a stand of mixed-age sugar maple trees, the oldest dating to the 1880s. When Nora inherited the notebook, she also inherited the system Ruth had built inside it. Hatch was a 2-year-old dog that winter, black and tan, broad through the chest, with a habit of sleeping near the evaporator when the fire was going. He had come to the farm as a stray the year after Ruth died, and Nora had kept him without discussion. He slept near the evaporator because the sugar house was warm and the work was steady, and the 2 of them suited each other that way. Nora worked the sap, Hatch slept, and the boiling went on through the March nights the way it always had. The pipeline consortium had been routing a natural gas line across the northern tier of Addison County since 2007. By 2009, they had bought or negotiated easements across 11 properties along the planned corridor, and the Holt farm sat squarely in the route's path. The corridor required a 40-foot cleared right-of-way. Through Nora's North Ridge, that corridor would have removed between 18 and 23 producing sugar maples, including 3 of the oldest trees on the property, each of them more than 100 years in the ground. A 40-foot swath through a grove that old does not grow back. The trees flanking the corridor would be stressed at their root margins for years. The microclimate would be broken open to the north wind. Crum had not modeled any of that, because none of it appeared in the revenue column. Dale Crum was not a bad man. He was sincere in his work, genuinely trying to thread the route with the least disruption he could manage, and he believed, the way a person who has been educated in land use economics believes, that a stand of 91 taps operated by one woman in her 60s was a hobby by any definition that mattered. He had run his projections. At then prevailing bulk maple prices, the grove grossed between $12,000 and $18,000 in a good year. The easement offer was $22,000. The math appeared obvious to him. He stood at the edge of the grove on a mid-May morning, his clipboard tucked under one arm, the rolled survey map resting against a young birch at the margin of the stand, and he gestured at the trees with a patience that was its own kind of condescension. He had clean boots, the kind with a company logo embossed on the heel. They had not touched the mud in the deeper part of the grove because he had stayed at the edge. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "you've got a sentimental hobby operation here. I understand the attachment, but we're offering you more than a full year's gross revenue for a corridor that honestly you probably won't notice once it's cleared and grassed over." Nora looked at the trees for a moment. One of the oldest ones, a wide canopy sugar maple she had tagged number 7 in her quadrant records. The one Ruth had iron-tacked in 1961 and noted as the highest-reading tree in the stand, stood about 30 feet into the proposed corridor line. Its trunk was nearly 3 feet across at shoulder height. The bark was thick and deeply furrowed in the way of very old trees, ridges running vertically the length of the trunk, the color of weathered iron. Then she said, "I'll notice." He waited to see if she would say more. She did not. He left the check on the kitchen table, which was how these conversations sometimes ended, and drove back down the gravel lane. The check sat on the table for 3 days. Nora went about her work in that time, checked the tap lines she had left in for a late sap run, split wood for the sugar house stack, oiled the evaporator pans for storage. On the 3rd day, she put the check in an envelope, wrote Crum's name on it, and mailed it back without a note. Her neighbor to the east, Warren Dix, was 52 years old that year and running 280 acres of dairy operation, 3rd generation on the land. Warren was a good farmer and a decent man, straightforward in the way of people who have worked a piece of ground for most of their lives and learned to say clearly what they mean. He had looked at the same kind of easement offer the consortium made him for the woodlot on his eastern fence line and taken it. $18,400 for a corridor through trees he had never tapped and did not plan to. He used the money as a down payment on a new freestall barn addition, poured the floor that fall, and had the framing up before the first hard frost. The consortium's projection for dairy margins over the next 5 years was favorable, and Warren had been told so by his extension contact, a different man from Crum, with the same kind of degree and the same confident presentation. Nora watched him pour concrete for the new barn floor that September, and thought nothing of it beyond hoping it held. Warren was a neighbor. What was good for Warren's farm was good for the county, and she was not in a position to argue with his projections. only with her own. If you have spent time in a sugar maple grove in early spring, you understand something about what Nora was protecting that Dale Crumb's spreadsheet could not accommodate. Let me tell you about old-growth sugar maples, because the science of what they do is the engine of everything that happened in 2018. A sugar maple tree begins producing commercially tappable sap at roughly 40 years of age. At 80 years, the tree's root system, which by then has extended laterally to a radius matching the canopy spread, intersects with layers of soil and mineral deposits that younger trees have not yet reached. The sugars in maple sap, primarily sucrose, are produced by the tree through photosynthesis stored as starch in the wood and bark, then converted and mobilized during the freeze-thaw cycles of late winter and early spring. The concentration of sugar in the sap is directly influenced by the carbohydrate reserves the tree has built over its growing history, which means that an older tree with a larger wood volume and more extensive root access to soil nutrients tends to produce sap with higher sugar content than a younger tree of the same species growing in similar conditions. Ruth's notebook documents this across 3 decades. The oldest trees in the grove, the ones she labeled with iron tacks and numbered in the notebook, consistently ran refractometer readings 2 to 3% higher than the younger, nursery-planted stock she had used to fill gaps. 2 to 3% sounds like a modest number. In the sugar house, it is the difference between a batch that runs at 38 to 1 and one that runs at 46 to 1. 38 to 1 means you boil 38 gallons of sap to produce 1 gallon of finished syrup. 46 to 1 means you boil 46 gallons for the same result. The higher content trees are more efficient, more economical, and produce a syrup with a distinct flavor profile that food scientists refer to as terroir, the way the word is used in wine, meaning a character imparted by the specific minerals and biological communities of the soil in which the tree lives. Nora had understood this intuitively before she had the language for it. Ruth had understood it before Nora. The notebook was a record of that understanding, written in pencil across 36 years of mornings. There is another thing Ruth's notebook contained that is worth explaining, because Crumb's model had no place for it either. Sugar maple trees are tapped by drilling a small hole, called a tap hole, into the sapwood just inside the bark, and inserting a spout through which the sap runs. A tap hole wounds the tree. The tree responds by compartmentalizing the wound, walling it off with a zone of non-conductive wood that the tree does not fully recover from. If you tap the same spot twice, the wound compounds and the compartment grows larger. Commercial operations running high-density vacuum systems often retap the same zones year after year, and over time the wounding builds until the productive sapwood near the tap site begins to shrink. The trees keep producing, but less efficiently, and the operation needs more taps to get the same output. Ruth's rotation system moved each tap point on the trunk by a measured distance every season. She had worked out the geometry herself over years, watching the callous tissue heal and reading the results in the refractometer each morning. Her notes from the 1970s show the trial and error. She tried 2-inch offsets, 3-inch offsets, varied the face of the trunk, recorded healing rates and the following year's sap yield from the adjacent zone. By the 1980s, she had settled on a 3 to 4-inch lateral offset, alternating faces of the trunk across a 3-year cycle, and the oldest trees in her grove were producing as steadily as they had when she began. The tap holes healed. The productive sapwood stayed intact. This was the practice Nora inherited and continued. It was one reason the grove was still carrying 91 taps on 63 trees, without tap hole depletion after more than 50 years of production. A high vacuum operation on the same trees would have shown measurable sapwood damage within a decade. Beginning in 2010, the year after she turned down the easement, Nora added a new section to the notebook. She divided the grove into soil quadrants based on a basic pH and organic matter test she ran herself with an extension office kit, and she began mapping which trees corresponded to which quadrant. She tagged the tap holes by quadrant and started keeping separate boiling records for each group. By 2013, she had documented, from her own data, that the stand produced 3 distinct flavor profiles. The oldest trees on the upper slope gave a light, clear, high sugar content run. The mid-slope group that Ruth had tapped most heavily produced a mid-range amber. The lower slope trees planted in the 1960s, whose root systems had grown into the wetter, higher mineral soil near the drainage, gave a dark, robust syrup with a depth the other batches did not have. She was not publishing this. She was not presenting it at meetings. She was writing it in the green notebook, in the same pencil columns Ruth had used, and she was adjusting her production accordingly. The Township Rural Development Forum met in January of 2012 in the community room of the Addison County Cooperative Extension Building, folding tables set in rows, coffee urn at the back, maybe 40 farmers and agricultural lenders in attendance on a cold Wednesday evening. Dale Crum was on a 3-person panel, and he presented a regional land use analysis that ran to 23 slides. He had good data, clearly gathered, and his presentation was the kind that earns respect from a room of practical people because it does not oversell. He showed income per acre by agricultural use category: milk, grain, vegetable, specialty crops, timber, maple. The maple column was among the lowest. He had aggregated the data from state revenue filings, which meant he was measuring what people reported grossing, not what they were actually earning per unit of product differentiated by quality. He noted, moving on to the next slide, that Boutique Legacy uses in the sugar bush category his phrase tended to pencil out only when the operator was willing to value sentiment over margin. He said it in the neutral, informative register of a person conveying a fact. He had no reason to be unkind about it. The data said what the data said. He did not name Nora Holt. He did not need to. The people at the tables knew which farms along the consortium corridor had refused easements, and one of them was the only sugar bush operation of any scale in the northern tier of the county. Warren Dix was in the room. He nodded along. He had already ordered the milk replacement equipment on a 5-year note at 6.2%, and Crum's slide on dairy projections showed exactly the kind of margin improvement Warren was counting on. Nora was not at the meeting. She had sugar bush taps to check before the storm came in. She learned about the panel from a neighbor a week later, and she did not say anything about it except to ask what the weather slide had shown. Meg Holt was 26 years old in the spring of 2017, freshly finished with her MBA from the University of Vermont, and she had come back to the farm the way people sometimes come back, not because she had run out of other options, but because she had run the numbers and decided the place deserved a real look. She had taken a job offer in Burlington and turned it down, not on impulse, but after a week of looking at what the farm's production data actually showed, once she had access to 2 years of QuickBooks files her father had set up and never fully used. The data was incomplete. It did not include the full value of the differentiated batches, because Nora had not differentiated them in the accounting, only in the production records in the notebook. Meg could see what was there approximately, and she thought someone with her training could do something with it. She was direct, energetic, comfortable with spreadsheets, and she had grown up watching her grandmother tend the grove with a seriousness that she had, for most of her life, attributed to a kind of rural stubbornness she was not sure she shared. She had not been wrong exactly about the stubbornness. She had been wrong about what was underneath it. She had been back 6 weeks when Dale Crum returned. He came in April with a junior assistant who carried the updated maps, and he knocked at the farmhouse door and asked if he might walk the grove again. The consortium was revisiting the corridor route in light of a proposed expansion. Nora said she would walk with him. Meg followed. Crum was pleasant. He had aged 10 years well, still trim, the same rimless glasses, and he remembered Nora without apparent difficulty. He walked the grove's edge, looked at the trees with a professional assessment that was neither admiring nor dismissive, and said quietly the thing he had said in variations before. "I understand you're attached, Mrs. Holt," he said, "but at 91 taps, you're never going to operate beyond hobby scale. The market's changed. There are operations in Quebec running 40,000 taps on vacuum systems. This is a lovely grove. It just doesn't pencil out at commercial scale." Meg said nothing. Nora said nothing. Crum left with his maps and his patience intact. In the truck going back down the lane, Meg turned the phrase over in her mind. Hobby scale. She had heard something like it in economics coursework. The minimum efficient scale argument. The idea that below a certain production threshold, a business cannot compete. She found herself thinking Crum was probably right and feeling vaguely guilty about it. That evening, she picked up Ruth's green notebook from the sugar house shelf, the way she had picked it up a dozen times over the years, and this time she read it differently. She read it the way she had been trained in the past 2 years to read a business record. She looked at the refractometer readings across 3 decades and saw what Ruth had been doing. She sat with it for an hour, and then she went and found her grandmother in the kitchen and asked, for the first time in her life, a genuine question about the trees. "What's the difference between the upper slope batch and the lower slope batch?" she said. Nora looked at her for a moment, then she said, "Sit down." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Nora laid out the quadrant maps, hand-drawn on graph paper in 2 colors of pencil. The soil quadrants in blue and the tap point rotation schedule in red. She had never shown them to anyone outside the family. She showed Meg the boiling records by quadrant, going back to 2010. 7 years of data in columns alongside Ruth's 36. She walked her through the 3 flavor profiles, the way the upper slope syrup ran clear and intensely sweet, how that concentration affected the boiling ratio and the finished volume, what grade A medium amber from old-growth trees was fetching at specialty retail compared to commodity bulk, and why those were effectively different products despite coming from the same species of tree. Meg sat at the kitchen table with her calculator and ran the numbers as Nora talked. She was quiet for a long time after. She had spent 2 years learning how to read financial models, and what she was looking at was a model that someone had been building in pencil columns for 53 years without knowing that was what it was. If you have ever sat across a table from someone who knows something, the way Nora Holt knew those trees, you understand the particular quality of that silence. It is not the silence of a person who cannot explain what they know. It is the silence of someone who sees no particular reason to explain it until the other person is ready to hear it. If you have had a person like that in your life, you know what I mean. Leave a comment if you do. Nora got up and put the kettle on. She asked Meg if she wanted to walk the grove in the morning. Meg said yes. They walked it at first light the next day, Hatch moving ahead of them through the low brush at the grove margin, his nose working the cold air. Nora showed Meg each of the numbered iron tacks on the oldest trees, the ones Ruth had placed in 1961, each tack a small square of dark metal flush with the bark, and the bark grown slightly around it over the decades. She showed her the tap rotation marks, the healed-over dimples in the sapwood where previous taps had sealed. On the number 7 tree, the wide canopy maple that would have stood in the middle of Crumb's proposed corridor, the rotation marks spiraled around the lower trunk in a pattern you could read like a record, 50-some seasons of careful work encoded in healed wood. Meg put her hand flat against the bark. The tree was broad enough that she could not have reached around it. The spring of 2016 had already passed by then, and both of them knew what it had cost. Let me tell you about March of 2016, because it is the hinge on which everything turned. Vermont's maple season runs, in a normal year, from late February through mid-April, governed almost entirely by the pattern of freezing nights and thawing days that causes the sap to run. When nights stay above freezing for too long, the trees break dormancy early, and the sap goes bitter. The run ends. In March of 2016, an anomalous warm system settled across northern New England and held for 11 days. Night temperatures in Addison County averaged 38 degrees Fahrenheit, when they should have been in the mid-20s. The sap ran briefly and then stopped. The run was 11 days shorter than average, and across the county, sap sugar content had dropped significantly from the previous season. The industrial and semi-industrial operations, the high-volume producers running thousands of taps on synthetic tubing systems across monoculture or near monoculture planted stands, took the worst losses. Those stands were planted at high density for yield efficiency, and the trees had shallower, younger root systems with less soil mineral access. The anomalous heat hit them like a system failure, which is exactly what it was. 2 large commercial operations in Washington County reported losses exceeding 40% of their projected output. Nora's Grove ran 14 days. It was not a banner year. The oldest trees, the upper slope group, ran 3 days longer than the lower slope group, and their sugar content, Ruth's tack-numbered trees, held within 1% of the previous year's reading. The deep roots had buffered the heat. The microclimate created by the old canopy, wide crowns spaced far apart, letting cold settle in pockets beneath them, had kept the night temperatures at the grove floor measurably cooler than the open fields below. Nora had not designed this. Ruth had not designed this. The trees had designed it, across 140 years of growth, for their own reasons, and it happened to align perfectly with what a maple producer needs. She ran 2,280 pounds of grade A medium amber and 1,140 pounds of dark robust that season, below her average but above every comparable scale operation in the county. Warren Dix's dairy had failed by then. The 2016 heat wave had hit his herd during a period of already compressed milk margins, and the combination was more than the operation could absorb. He had borrowed against the freestall barn to cover 2 seasons of feed costs when milk prices dropped below his break-even threshold in 2014. And when the heat came in 2016, his herd was already carrying the stress of a thin margin year. 42 cows did not make it through the summer. He sold the remaining 70 at a loss in September. The price crash in 2017 finished what the heat had started, and Warren filed for Chapter 12, bankruptcy protection, in February of 2017. The same month, the first catalog of an equipment auction arrived at his mailbox addressed to his grandfather's name. He was a man who had followed every piece of credentialed advice available to him. From the Extension Service from the lender's agricultural specialist, from Dale Crumb's panel at the 2012 forum, from the dairy cooperative's own projection materials, and had been broken by forces that none of those models had adequately weighted. No one had been dishonest with him. The models had simply been wrong about which kind of season would arrive and when. Nora brought food to Warren's house twice that winter, a pot of soup the first time, a roast the second. She sat with his wife Carla in the kitchen while Warren was outside and did not mention the easement offer he had taken in 2009 or the barn note or any of the choices that had preceded the filing. He was not a man who needed to hear what he already knew, and Nora was not a woman who would say it. Hatch lay outside on the cold porch of Warren's house while Nora was inside, the way he always waited when she went somewhere he could not follow. It was February, and the air was below zero, and he lay there anyway, his chin on his front paws, patient. The consortium ultimately rerouted the pipeline corridor north of the Holt property line after a wetland survey flagged a protected drainage area in the original path. The route change had been in process since 2014, well before the 2016 season. But the county notice informing affected landowners did not reach Nora until late 2017. She read it standing at the mailbox in November, then walked back up the lane and set it on the sugar house shelf next to Ruth's notebook. The route had changed for reasons that had nothing to do with her refusal. The grove was untouched for reasons that had nothing to do with the consortium's goodwill. She did not mistake one thing for the other, and she went back to work. Elise Renner arrived on an August morning in 2018, unannounced except for a 2-line email Meg had handled. She was the senior buyer for the Vermont Craft Goods Division of a regional co-op chain with 22 retail locations across New England, a woman in her mid-40s who had spent 17 years sourcing specialty food products and had the manner of someone who had tasted enough things to trust her own palate absolutely. She had come because Meg had sent her a sample kit, 3 4-ounce mason jars packed in a cardboard sleeve, one from each quadrant batch, with a 2-page typed summary explaining the age of the stand, the tap rotation system, the soil quadrant differentiation, and the 53-year documentation history beginning with Ruth's notebook. Renner had read the note twice on the drive up. She tasted the jars at the kitchen table, in order, light to dark, a small spoonful of each with a pause and a glass of water between. The first jar she tasted and set down without comment. The second she tasted and held the spoon for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. The third she set aside and went back to the second. The grade A medium amber from the upper slope trees, Ruth's numbered trees, and held the jar to the kitchen window light for a long time. The light that came through the jar was amber and clear and very still. She set it down. Then she asked a question that was not really a question. How many producers in Vermont are pulling this flavor profile from old growth stock? Nora said, not many that I know of. Renner said, no, there aren't. She was quiet for another moment. Then she opened her bag and took out a contract template. I'm not going to negotiate price with you. I want to offer you a standing contract at $3.40 per pound, grade A, medium amber, and $2.90 per pound, dark robust. I want first right of refusal on your full annual output. You tell me if that's workable. Nora looked at the numbers on the template. The contracted rate for grade A, medium amber, was roughly 60% above the bulk market price for equivalent grade maple syrup. It was the kind of price that exists only for things a buyer cannot find elsewhere. She said it was workable. The contract was signed at the kitchen table that morning. Renner's pen, 2 copies. She took one copy and left one, drove back down the gravel lane, and was gone before noon. Nora put the signed copy on the sugar house shelf next to Ruth's notebook and went out to check a fence line on the south pasture. The contract covered the 2018 season's production, already complete, and committed to the same terms for 3 subsequent seasons, with annual adjustment for market index. Meg ran the full arithmetic that November evening in the sugar house, with Hatch sleeping near the evaporator the way he had always slept through the sugar house work, his muzzle gone gray now at 9 years old, the broad chest still steady. Still, she pulled the 2018 season's production records from the notebook. 2,280 pounds, grade A, medium amber, and 1,140 pounds, dark robust, applied the contracted rates, and added the 2 advance payments Renner's office had already wired. She wrote the total on a piece of paper and set it on the shelf next to Ruth's notebook. $187,400. The paper sat there. The evaporator ticked as it cooled. Hatch shifted once, resettled, and went still. Meg read the number aloud. Nora picked the paper up, looked at it for a moment the way she had looked at Crumb's check in 2009. Then she set it back down. She went outside and stood at the sugar house door for a long time, looking at the grove on the north ridge. The November maples were bare by then, the trunks dark against a gray sky, the canopy open and wide and patient, the way very old trees stand in the cold. The number had landed in that small sugar house room the way a verdict lands when there is nothing left to argue. It was not a number that asked for commentary. It was simply what the trees had produced, through 91 taps on 63 trees, through a spiral-bound green notebook, and 36 years of Ruth's mornings, and 11 years of Nora's quadrant maps, through a warm March in 2016 that had broken every model in the county, except the one that was not a model at all. Just a record of what those particular trees had done across more than half a century of seasons. When Meg called the county extension office the following week, she reached a staff agronomist named Phil Goss, who had been on the panel with Crum at the 2012 Township Forum. She told him the Grove's 2018 production, the contracted rate, and the gross revenue figure. There was a silence on the line that ran for several seconds, long enough that Meg thought the call had dropped. "That's," Goss said and stopped. "That's a real number." He asked if anyone from the extension office could come out and look at the quadrant documentation. He phrased it as an opportunity for the office, which is how people phrase things when they are quietly revising a position. He was not embarrassed, not precisely, but his voice had changed register in the way that voices do when the model a person has been operating from turns out to have a significant gap in it. Meg said they were welcome out. She said her grandmother would be happy to show them the notebook. She did not say that the notebook had been there all along. She did not need to. Goss had been in Addison County long enough to know exactly where the notebook had been. The following spring, 2019, Nora invited 3 neighboring farm families to the sugar house for what she called, without ceremony, a tap-line workshop. She had not advertised it. She had called each family directly, people she knew had trees or were considering tapping, and asked if they wanted to come out on a Saturday morning in March. All 3 families came. She walked them through Ruth's rotation system, the tap point offset practice and the reasoning behind it, the callus tissue healing she had observed across 4 decades on her oldest trees and what it looked like in the healed-over dimples on the numbered trunks. She explained the refractometer, how to use one and what to do with the readings across a season, how to identify which trees in a stand were highest performing, and what soil conditions tended to correlate with the result. She showed them the quadrant records and explained what the boiling ratios meant by soil zone, and what the implication was for grading and pricing if you kept the batches separate. She sold 2 of the 3 families 400 pounds of certified scion wood in total, wild collected hardwood cuttings from the grove's oldest specimens, each bundle tagged with the source tree number from Ruth's notebook and the documented refractometer average for that tree over the previous 5 seasons. The cuttings were for grafting onto rootstock the families already had on their properties, and at the end of the morning, Nora showed them the grafting technique as well, which she had learned from an old orcharding manual she had borrowed from the county library in 2011 and adapted for maple stock. She refused an offer from Phil Goss at the Extension office to publish her quadrant data under the office's institutional letterhead, on the grounds that the data belonged to the notebook and the notebook belonged to the farm. She allowed Meg to co-author a field note with Goss instead, a 12-page document with the quadrant maps and the production records appended as tables. It appeared in a regional agricultural journal the following year under Meg's name and Goss's name, with Ruth Holt acknowledged by name in the opening paragraph for the original documentation methodology. Warren Dix attended the Tapline workshop. He had not re-entered farming by then and did not intend to. He came alone, arriving before the other families, and he stood at the back of the sugar house against the wall where the stack of cordwood met the stone foundation, and he listened to the whole morning without saying much. At the end, when the others had gone out to look at the trees, he said quietly, to no one in particular, that he wished he had known what was in those trees 20 years ago. Nora heard him. She was cleaning the refractometer with a cloth and did not stop doing it. She said she thought most of what was in those trees had always been there. He nodded. They left it at that, which was the right way to leave it. Meg took over the operation management in 2020, 3 years after she had returned. She runs the books, manages the co-op correspondence, handles the tap rotation scheduling, and makes the decisions about which trees to retire from production in any given season, which is a decision that requires reading the notebook entries going back to the tree's first record. She added a new section to the back of Ruth's Greenfield notebook in her own handwriting for the quadrant records going forward, the same column format Ruth had used, the same notation for sugar content readings and boiling ratios and overnight temperatures. The notebook is spiral-bound and cracked along the spine and sits on the same shelf above the evaporator, where Nora set it the year Ruth died, in 1998, when she brought it in from the house where Ruth had kept it, and put it in the place where it would be used. It is the oldest thing in the sugar house. On the mornings of the sugar run, Hatch sleeps in the corner near the evaporator, his gray muzzle resting on the stone threshold of the door, and the steam rises in the cold air around him. And Meg works the evaporator the way Nora worked it before her, steadily and without hurry, checking the refractometer every 40 minutes the way Ruth's notebook says to do. Here is what was really at stake in that grove, and it was not the easement money, and it was not even the syrup. Dale Crum arrived in 2009 carrying a kind of knowledge that is genuinely useful and genuinely incomplete. It measures what is easy to measure: gross revenue per acre, production volume, the ratio of income to acreage against a regional average. It is built for scale, calibrated to the aggregated view, and it is very good at identifying what a system can readily count. What it cannot count is 140 years of root growth into a particular hillside. What it cannot count is 36 years of refractometer readings in a pencil column in a spiral-bound notebook. What it cannot count is the microclimate that builds under old-growth canopy, spaced the way old trees space themselves, or the way that microclimate holds cold against a warm March night and keeps the sap running 3 days longer than the stand up the road. Nora Holt's knowledge was the other kind. It was narrow. It was specific to a single hillside in Addison County, Vermont. It had been built across 2 lifetimes at the pace of 1 season at a time, and it was recorded in a notebook that looked like nothing, a school supply, a dollar store item. Next to Dale Crumb's rolled survey maps and consortium projections, it could not be scaled. It could not be applied broadly. It was exactly as useless as it appeared unless you happened to need to know precisely what those 63 trees would do in a warm March, and why and how to make the most of what they would still give you. The structural shock that settled over Vermont in March of 2016 did not settle the argument through drama. It settled it through arithmetic. The operations that had been built for scale and efficiency, uniform stands, vacuum systems, high tap density, were built on the assumption that the system they operated inside would remain stable enough for their model to hold. When the model failed, there was no depth to fall back on. The knowledge that built those operations did not include a plan for what to do when the nights stopped freezing on schedule, because that knowledge had never needed one. The knowledge in Ruth Holt's notebook included a plan for that, in a way. The plan was the trees themselves. It was the choice to tend what was already there rather than replace it with something newer and more efficient. The choice to add tap lines one at a time across a decade rather than stringing synthetic tubing at scale. The choice to boil 3 batches separately and document the difference rather than blend them for volume. None of it was faster. None of it was cheaper. All of it was right at the time horizon that mattered. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are not always the same list. Ruth Holt knew this. Nora Holt knew it without ever stating it. Meg Holt learned it from a printed contract in a spiral-bound notebook on a November evening in a sugar house in Addison County, with steam on the walls and an old dog asleep near the door. What holds, in the end, is what belongs to the ground it grew in.